At home and abroad, the Iranian government is taking the bull by the horns. Over in Geneva, Iran is busy finding middle ground with the West over its nuclear program. And back home, big decisions are being made about the subsidy reform plan. Government and Parliament are studying ways to change the system of distributing the cash handouts people have been getting as compensation for the lifting of subsidies. In this episode of Iran Today, we will take a closer look at Iran's subsidy reform plan and the latest developments. The Parliament's Budget Committee has announced that it will be passing a bill that will allow the revision of the way cash handouts are given. The proposed bill will make it possible for the administration to remove the top 3 tiers of the society from the list of cash handout recipients. This is not the first time the Parliament has revised the plan since its implementation in 2010. Right after it was put into effect, Parliament and economic experts praised the government for its courageous move that would hopefully reform a worn-out economic system. The reform plan's immediate effect was positive for the government, but a year after its implementation, it was taking its toll on the national economy. Everyone agreed that subsidy reform was vital, but Parliament and Ahmadinejad's administration disagreed on how it should be done. In December 2012, the Parliament decided to suspend the second phase of the plan. Now, nearly 3 years later, Rouhani's administration has the daunting task of finding a solution to the cash handouts problem. This time, the Parliament and government had a meeting and various solutions were discussed. All Iran's major development plans, especially the 20-year vision plan, are aimed at making the country a regional economic heavyweight by 2025. That's why Iran's government decided to change the country's economic structures via an economic reform plan that affects all aspects of the national economy. Subsidy reform is a large chunk of that plan. In December 2010, the government started removing energy subsidies that would take 5 years to complete. It also started giving out compensation in the form of direct cash handouts that were wired to people's accounts every month.
We can say that the subsidy reform plan was the only law which all parts of the government, social and economic groups and ordinary people unanimously agreed on. They all believed that distributing subsidies equally to all people, including the rich and the poor, is mere injustice. No government in the world distributes subsidies like the way we distributed before the implementation subsidy reform plan. Giving subsidies on some commodities, social services, drinking water, electricity, and natural gas is plausible only on the occasion of an urgent situation like war or revolution. Actually, no one refutes that the subsidies should be targeted.
The main objectives of the plan were to distribute national wealth fairly and equally, to minimize income inequality, to raise energy prices to the international market level, to increase efficiency and prevent wasteful consumption, to reduce fuel smuggling, and to redirect the money saved towards production.
یکی از ایرادات ساختاری اقتصاد ایران این بودش که
The problem with the structure of Iran's economy was that a huge volume of subsidies were distributed among different groups of people in a non-targeted way. The method had adversely affected the efficiency of the subsidies in the economy. It had also developed social injustice. A huge volume of direct, indirect cash or commodity subsidies had exerted enormous pressure on the government and also the economy. Accordingly, the subsidy reform law was ratified and then implemented in order to fix the prices, to support the production sector, to direct the subsidies toward the underprivileged, to provide necessities for low-income families, to tune up income distribution systems and to remove non-productive subsidies.
The government believes that the price of petrol should be increased promptly to reach the Persian Gulf free on-board price. One of the reasons for this was fuel smuggling. Because Iran's fuel cost a fraction of the price it cost people in neighboring countries, it was smuggled out on a regular basis. After the implementation of subsidy reform, there has been a sharp drop in this kind of illegal trade. The lull was short-lived, however, with fuel smuggling going up again after the value of Iran's currency, the rial, dropped due to sanctions.
اتفاقی که افتاد این بود که وقتی دولت شروع کرد به
After the administration launched the subsidy reform plan, the price of gasoline increased from 1,000 rials per liter to 4,000 rials per liter. That means it increased to 30 cents per liter. Now, due to the rial's depreciation, the price of gasoline declined to 12 cents per liter. This made fuel smuggling more attractive. I think the government did not succeed in stopping the fuel smuggling, contrary to the objective envisaged in the subsidy reform plan. The government not only did not manage to reduce fuel smuggling, but also exacerbated the situation.
Another reason why the government saw fit to increase fuel prices was to encourage energy efficiency and reduce fuel waste. Iran used to spend $100 billion on energy subsidies every year, $45 billion of which was spent on fuel. Before the implementation of the subsidy reform plan, fuel consumption had reached 62 million litres a day. If this level of consumption had continued, it would have reached 135 million litres today.
After the implementation of the subsidy reform plan, gasoline consumption in the country decreased to 65 million litres per day. The consumption had been more than 120 million litres each day. This was one of the positive effects of the subsidy reform plan. The consumption of kerosene and other fuels declined as well.
Apart from the decrease in fuel consumption, consumption of drinking water, electricity and natural gas decreased significantly in the country. The government made huge efforts to make the prices actual. It tried to increase the price of gasoline to the Persian Gulf free on-board price. It also tried to increase the price of electricity and drinking water to their total costs. This made the families make revisions in their consumption, so the consumption pattern in the country was relatively revised.
Subsidy reform was a vital step towards boosting production in the country in order to rejuvenate the national economy. That meant the government would have to allocate 30% of the money saved by removing the subsidies to production. Experts and officials believe that Ahmadinejad's administration failed to support the production sector the way it was supposed to, according to the subsidy reform law.
The subsidy reform law required the administration to allocate 30% of the revenue made by removing the subsidies to the production sector. Now we can ask where this share of the revenue was spent. The government should have given subsidies to agriculture, industry, production and health. All statistics show that the government has not paid the subsidies to these sectors. Actually, there was no money to pay. The money should have been allocated in a specific period, as it was specified by the law. As a consequence of the mismanagement, the current problems have been created.
In order to promote economic and social justice in the country, the plan stipulated that 50% of the money saved by removing subsidies should be given back to the Iranian people as compensation. At first, the money was supposed to be distributed among lower-income families and the poor, not the rich, but in the end, everyone got the same amount regardless of their tier. Economic experts say that is where the system failed.
اصلا این اقدامی که صورت گرفت هدفمندی یارانه نبود.
The measures that were taken were not in line with the subsidy reform plan. Targeting subsidies means to direct the subsidies toward the targeted groups of people. The targeted groups of people are the unprivileged, those who are affected via economic reforms or lifting price controls. In a subsidy reform plan, all people in the society are affected, especially those who benefited from the subsidies more than others. But the government should help those who are affected the most. So targeting subsidies means to direct subsidies to some specific groups.
The government has had trouble doling out the cash handouts promised because the amount saved via subsidy reform has been less than predicted. Because of this, every now and then the government fails to pay people on time. Rouhani's administration is revising the cash handouts distribution system. On October 12, Iran's Vice President for Supervision and Strategic Affairs, Mohammad Bagher Nobakht, said the administration is finding it very difficult to pay compensation. He indicated that at the moment, the government is paying over $1.5 million in cash handouts every month.
According to economic theories, it cannot be accepted that the government appropriates a huge amount of the country's budget, over $16 billion, for a sector which does not help industries or production sector. Moreover, I think the current mechanism of subsidy distribution creates serious problems for the national economy.
دلیل اصلیش این هست که دولت قبل
The main reason for the budget deficit is that the previous administration spent more than the amount of revenue made by removing the subsidies, which was contrary to the subsidy reform law. In order to remove the shortfall, the administration used the forbidden financial resources. The administration committed itself to considerable amounts of expenses, while there were no financial resources for them. The commitment has been transferred to the current administration.
In the budget for Iran's 2013 to 2014 fiscal year, the parliament allowed the government to increase the price of energy carriers up to 38% to raise the funds necessary to pay people compensation. The government is allowed to increase the price of energy carriers if the second phase of the subsidy reform plan is implemented. Rouhani's administration decided not to increase the price of energy carriers because by doing this, the price of commodities would inevitably go up as well, and that means higher liquidity and inflation rates. The current inflation rate, according to official sources, is around 40%.
The administration decided not to raise the price of energy carriers due to the current situations in the country. The administration has just begun its work. We are under economic sanctions and the inflation rate has reached over 40%. I think any increase in the price of fuels brings about inflationary effects. So the current administration will not cover the budget shortfall by increasing the price of energy carriers. Instead, it will find new financial resources like extra money in the National Development Fund or selling its properties. However, we cannot continue the subsidy reform plan in future without increasing the price of energy carriers, because the plan is a package which should be implemented in every aspect.
We allowed the administration to raise the prices in order to eliminate the budget deficit. The administration is able to cover the shortfall by removing the high-income cash handouts recipients and increasing the price of energy carriers. Increasing the price of gasoline is one of the ways, because gasoline does not play a very important role in the production sector. I think the price of commodities is getting cheap, so it's better to increase the prices to make them actual. The price increase should be made gradually, so it's better to start increasing the price of gasoline now.
In recent weeks, the price of energy and drinking water has increased slightly. Officials, however, say that the increase does not mean the government has started implementing the second phase of the subsidy reform plan. Because the revenue generated by removing these subsidies is not equal to the amount needed for the cash handouts, the government has had to eliminate the deficit by taking the money from the National Development Fund and the energy sector, which includes oil and gas companies. On October 19th, Iran's oil minister Bijan Namdar Zanganeh criticized the government's method of providing cash handouts and warned that it should be changed as soon as possible.
According to the statistics, since the beginning of the subsidy reform plan to the end of August 2012, in a 20-month period, $30 billion was paid to people in cash handouts, while the revenue generated during that period was $18 billion. The shortfall was covered by loans from the central bank. Also, the revenues of organizations like National Oil Product Distribution Company or Tabanir were spent to finance the budget deficit.
Getting loans from the central bank, selling its properties, taking money from the National Development Fund, or any other similar ways of covering the budget deficit causes hyperinflation in the country.
Covering the budget shortfall by taking the money from oil and gas revenues is unjust. Our oil and gas resources belong to all generations. Our natural resources belong to future generations as well. Therefore, we do not have any right to use all these intergenerational resources for our welfare.
MP Ahmad Tawakkoli has also criticized the current method of compensating people for subsidy reform, saying that out of the 20 countries that have done subsidy reform, only Iran pays people compensation in the form of direct cash handouts. Along those lines, he is preparing a bill to be discussed in Parliament. He says giving everyone compensation, irrespective of their income tier, is a mistake and must be revised. According to the bill, people in the top 3 income tiers won't receive the $18 everyone is getting every month anymore.
Now that the administration has no money to pay the cash handouts, it has to take an urgent measure which should be fair and efficient. The best way is what we have proposed. The Parliament's Economic Committee has ratified that after a 3-month period, the government has to stop giving cash handouts to high-income people. This way, the budget deficit will be reduced. The subsidy reform plan has many other problems which should be repaired later. We have to revise many parts of the law because of the forex rate fluctuations.
Nearly all Iran's lawmakers as well as the government agree that withholding 30% of the cash handouts which are now being given to high-income families will solve the deficit problem. It's estimated that around 22 million people will no longer get subsidy reform compensation. But the experts say the government does not have the necessary data to do so. At the moment, the government has no way of knowing for sure how much people are actually making and who makes up the 3 top tiers of the income bracket. In a meeting between lawmakers, executive officials and economic experts on October 15th, some officials and experts argue that it is possible to identify these people, but others deem it impossible.
The question is who the people at the top 3 tiers are. How many people are at these tiers? Is there any mechanism to identify them? How can we know people's level of income? We have disagreements on the mechanism of identifying these tiers. Who are considered high-income people? Do we have a statistical bank to identify them? These are our questions.
Turnover of all bank accounts is recorded in the central bank, which should not be announced publicly. But we can require the central bank to report people whose turnover is above a specific level. We do not need to know the volume of turnover. The National Tax Administration has huge information about people's income. The administration levies taxes according to incomes. More tax means higher income. Names of all automobile owners are also recorded in traffic police data center. Luxury car means high income. We can know about people's incomes by using these data.
4 research groups have been formed by Rouhani's administration in order to study ways of finding out how much Iranian families really make. This is necessary in order to pave the way for the second phase of the subsidy reform plan that will be implemented in the next fiscal year.
The research groups have been formed in various areas, including energy, economy, social affairs, and financial affairs. These working groups study the effects of the new amendment to the subsidy reform law. They study, for example, the effects of removing top 3 tiers from receiving cash handouts on prices. The administration, fortunately, has started the study before the parliament requires it officially. We are glad that the administration believes that at this time the amendment is the best way to deal with this problem.
The Iranian people get cash handouts every month. Iran's subsidies targeting organization has proposed that the money be deposited every 3 months instead.
Giving cash handouts every 3 months does not help solve the problem because the real solution is to reduce the administration's commitments. I think it will never be practical. It just helps postpone the administration's commitment to the next 3 months. We should think of far-sighted policies to solve our problems instead of proposing these short-sighted suggestions. This can act like a painkiller, but not a real solution for the problems that have been transferred from the previous administration. To postpone solving a problem has its own costs.
While a lot of the discussion revolves around how and when to distribute the cash handouts, there are those officials and experts who say the money shouldn't be given to people directly at all. One of the indirect methods of distributing subsidies is to give direct cash handouts to the underprivileged but give the rest bonds.
In my opinion, giving bonds instead of cash handouts to people is not a practical solution. Economy has its own logics and equations. There is no difference between cash handouts and shares here. Shares and bonds have their own effects on the capital market.
People's distrust of the administration makes it difficult to solve the problem this way. If the administration removes this distrust, relying on the political epic in June, it can use bonds or national loans to cover its budget deficit.
After the subsidy reform plan came into being, how to implement it has been the subject of much debate and disagreement, especially between Parliament and Ahmadinejad's administration. Finally, in October 2012, the Parliament decided to suspend the implementation of the second phase of the subsidy reform plan to prevent price hikes that would hurt the nation. It is likely Rouhani's administration will implement the second phase of the plan in March 2014 of the new fiscal year.
The forex market should be stabilized if we want the subsidy reform plan to succeed. If we ignore the forex market, starting the second phase will increase the amount of stagflation in the country, so no substantial results will be achieved.
President Rouhani's economic officials have announced that the government will submit next year's budget bill on time on December 5th. The amount that will be allocated to cash handouts and where the money will come from are the important issues that must be specified in next year's budget plan.
باید نرخ رشد اقتصادی ایران اول منطقه باشه و در چشمانداز
In order to materialize its objectives, Iran should have the top economic growth in the region. According to the 20-year vision plan, we should have an 8% economic growth. If the administration wants to achieve this objective, it should implement the subsidy reform law in a smart way. It should not use illegal or detrimental ways like getting loans or printing new money to provide the funds to distribute the subsidies. All these points should be illustrated in the next year's budget bill.
Iran's efforts towards targeting its subsidies have been praised by the International Monetary Fund and, while not being perfect, have yielded positive results. Rouhani's administration has emphasized that the system of distributing cash handouts should be revised. Although making the plan more efficient for the economy is a daunting prospect that Rouhani will have to face, cooperating with Parliament should make it easier for his administration to solve the problem.